The old cabin on Hawthorne Ridge had always been a sanctuary for Grandpa Frank, nestled deep within the thick pine forests. It was a place of solace and quiet reflection, far removed from the busy world. Grandpa had retired here years ago after a long career as a sheriff in the city. His decision to leave behind the hustle and bustle and settle into a peaceful life had been met with understanding, and even some envy from his colleagues.
Oh.
No more patrol cars, no more sirens, just the rustling of leaves and the chirping of birds. The cabin, built by his own hands decades ago, was his pride and joy. It was a symbol of his hard work and a place where he could relax, tinker with old tools, and sip coffee on the porch as he watched the sun rise over the valley. But the world, as it always does, was changing. The once quiet roads around the cabin had begun to see more traffic. New homes were popping up like mushrooms after rain. The peacefulness Grandpa had come to cherish was slowly being chipped away, not by nature, but by the forces of development. New people, new rules, and worst of all, the HOA. It had started innocently enough with a letter Grandpa had received. A single sheet of paper, yellowed with age, but still professionally printed with the HOA's logo at the top. The letter stated that the Hawthorne Ridge Community Association was conducting routine inspections of all properties to ensure compliance with the neighborhood's new guidelines. He'd read it twice, then tossed it aside. He wasn't about to let some bureaucratic organization tell him how to live in his own home. The mountains were his domain, not theirs. But as the days went by, the letters kept coming. The HOA wanted to inspect his cabin to ensure that it met the new standards for the area. Grandpa knew what that meant. They were probably just after his land, looking for ways to force him to sell or face fines for supposed violations. Maybe they thought the rustic charm of his cabin was a nuisance. Or maybe they just didn't like the idea of an independent man living off the grid. Either way, he wasn't having it. Grandpa Frank wasn't a man who took kindly to being told what to do. During his years as sheriff, he had dealt with criminals, squatters, and all sorts of troublemakers, but none of them had ever made him feel as disrespected as the HOA's demand. His cabin, his land, and his life were sacred to him, and no one, not even a group of well-dressed bureaucrats, was going to change that. The first visit came unexpectedly one warm autumn afternoon. Grandpa was on the porch enjoying his usual ritual of sipping his coffee when a car pulled up the long gravel drive. A woman in a khaki suit got out, holding a clipboard and wearing a smile that seemed more like a sneer. "Good afternoon, sir," she said, her tone far too chipper for someone intruding on his land. "I'm Karen from the Hawthorne Ridge HOA. We've come to perform a property inspection to ensure compliance with community standards." Grandpa didn't stand up. He simply looked at her over the rim of his coffee cup, the steam rising between them. "I don't recall agreeing to any inspections," he said, his voice low but firm. "This is my land, and I don't need you poking around." Karen didn't seem to be fazed by his resistance. She just flashed a grin and stepped closer, her clipboard at the ready. "I'm afraid it's required by the new regulations. You'll need to let me in so we can assess the property." Grandpa's gaze never wavered. He had dealt with more intimidating figures than this woman, and he wasn't about to let her push him around. "I'm not interested in your regulations," he replied coolly. "This is my home, and you aren't welcome here." Karen's smile faltered for a moment, but she quickly recovered. "If you refuse to cooperate, you could be in violation of several HOA rules, and that could result in fines," she said, her voice now tinged with the arrogance of someone who thought she held the upper hand. Grandpa's hand tightened around the coffee cup, but he remained calm. "You'll have to find another cabin to inspect," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Good day, ma'am." He stood up slowly, deliberately, and turned away, heading back into the cabin. He could hear Karen shouting after him, but the door slammed behind him with finality, cutting off her words. He didn't need to hear them. It was clear what was coming: more letters, more visits, more pressure. But Grandpa Frank wasn't a man who could be intimidated, especially by someone like Karen. He'd built that cabin with his own hands, and no HOA was going to take that away from him. The battle was just beginning. Karen's first visit had stirred the dust, but didn't shake Grandpa Frank in the least. If anything, it only cemented his determination to stand his ground. He knew people like her, overconfident, self-important, and absolutely convinced they were always right. Karen was the type who used rules not to protect a community, but to control it. To her, everything was black and white. You're either obedient or you're an obstacle. And Frank, he'd been an obstacle to people like her his entire life. A few days after their initial confrontation, Karen returned. This time, she didn't come quietly. Her little silver crossover screeched to a halt at the edge of the gravel driveway like she owned the place. Grandpa had been splitting wood behind the cabin and heard the tires skidding on the loose stones. He wiped the sweat from his brow with a rag, took his time walking toward the front porch, and waited. Karen was already halfway up the steps before he even made it around the house. She wore a stiff blazer, far too formal for the mountain heat, and her signature clipboard was clutched tightly under her arm like it was a weapon. She looked out of place among the towering pines and the dirt path, like a misplaced office manager who'd wandered into the woods by mistake, but was too proud to admit it. "Mr. Franklin," she said sharply, abandoning all pretense of friendliness. "We need to talk." Grandpa raised an eyebrow. "We already did." "I believe the word you're looking for is trespassing. You're not supposed to be here." Karen gave a dry chuckle. "This entire property falls under the jurisdiction of the Hawthorne Ridge Homeowners Association. That means I have every right to be here. In fact, you're legally obligated to comply with our inspection process." Grandpa leaned against the porch post, arms crossed. "I don't recall signing anything that puts this land under your little club's rules." Karen's eyes narrowed. "We've expanded the HOA's jurisdiction to include neighboring lots that fall within our environmental oversight area. Section 8, subsection C12, allows us to monitor potential code violations related to unsanctioned land use. It's some kind of fancy way of saying you want to stick your nose where it doesn't belong?" "I'm saying," she hissed, stepping closer, "that if you don't let us in to inspect your property, we'll escalate the matter. You could be fined heavily." Frank let the words hang in the air for a moment. He wasn't the yelling type. He didn't need to be. His silence always spoke louder. Then he stepped forward, eyes locking onto hers. "Lady, I served 30 years as a sheriff. I've seen real law, real authority, and I can promise you you've got neither." Karen flinched slightly but tried to recover. "You think this is a joke? You think ignoring me is going to make me go away? No. I think eventually you'll realize how far out of line you are and turn that little clipboard of yours back to our town where it belongs." But she wasn't ready to give up. "We've received reports that you're violating zoning standards by storing unlicensed equipment and possibly harboring wildlife illegally. That's a serious offense." Frank actually laughed. "Wildlife? Lady, I feed raccoons and birds out back. That's not illegal. It's called having a backyard." Grin's face turned red with frustration. She looked like she wanted to scream, but couldn't quite bring herself to do it. She slapped a folded notice onto the porch railing. "This is your final warning. If you don't comply, we will take further action." With that, she stormed off down the steps, muttering under her breath about legal consequences and examples needing to be made. Frank picked up the notice without even unfolding it and tossed it straight into the fire pit nearby. He wasn't sure what further action meant in Karen's world, but he had a feeling she'd be back in next time. She wouldn't come alone. He'd dealt with criminals, conmen, and angry mobs in his time. Karen was something else. She was a bureaucrat with a mission and no sense of boundaries. And Grandpa Frank, he was just getting warmed up. The silence on Hawthorne Ridge didn't last long. After Karen's failed second attempt to intimidate Grandpa Frank, he figured she might take a few days to lick her wounds and move on. But he underestimated how deep her obsession with control really ran. She wasn't the kind to retreat. She was the kind to regroup, double down, and come back louder. 3 days after their last encounter, Grandpa was sitting at the kitchen table with his old police radio scanner humming in the background. He was sipping on a hot mug of black coffee and going through his toolbox when he saw headlights sweeping across the windows. It was barely past 8 a.m. Nobody came up his long driveway that early unless they were looking for trouble. He stood up slowly and moved toward the front window. 3 SUVs pulled up in a perfect, obnoxiously organized triangle formation in front of his cabin. Out stepped Karen, flanked by 2 other board members dressed like they were about to attend a corporate seminar, not hike into the woods. One of them, pudgy man with a printed tie awkwardly tucked into his shirt, held a folder marked Urgent Enforcement File.
The other.
A woman with slick back hair and a frown permanently etched. On her face, carried a camera. Karen stood in the middle, arms crossed, her face set in smug determination. This wasn't a courtesy visit, this was a power play. Grandpa didn't open the door this time. He waited on the porch, arms folded, shotgun leaning quietly against the wall behind him. He didn't touch it, but its presence made a statement. Karen raised her voice as soon as she saw him. Mr. Franklin, this is an official enforcement inspection authorized by the Hawthorne Ridge Homeowners Association under Emergency Clause 14B. We have received multiple reports from concerned residents alleging that your property may be storing dangerous wildlife or restricted materials. You are required to allow entry immediately. If Frank didn't blink, you're not law enforcement. You've got no right to enter this property without a court order. I highly doubt concerned residents exist, considering my nearest neighbor is 2 miles away and just happens to be a tree. The woman with the camera began snapping photos of the porch, the door, and the handmade no trespassing sign nailed into the railing. Karen stepped forward. You've been warned, Mr. Franklin. We have documentation of code violations and non-compliance. You don't cooperate, we will escalate this to the county. Grandpa stepped down 1 step. His voice was calm but sharp. Go ahead, call the county, call the governor if you want. But you're not stepping foot inside my cabin, not today, not ever. Karen's eyes glinted with defiance. You don't need your permission. Emergency enforcement protocols permit a forced inspection when health or safety is believed to be compromised. You can either let us in, or we'll document your obstruction and proceed accordingly. Then, without warning, she motioned to the pudgy board member, who moved toward the door like he was about to open it himself. That was it. Frank's boots hit the deck, hard as he stepped in front of them. Touch that door, and I swear you'll regret it, Karen snapped. You're interfering with an official inspection? Frank said, now nose to nose with her, his jaw clenched. You're trespassing, harassing, and attempting unlawful entry into a private residence. I told you to leave. That was your final warning. Karen's hand darted out like she might try to shove past him. That's when Grandpa moved in one smooth motion. Frank grabbed her wrist, spun her around, and with a click as smooth as butter, snapped a pair of handcuffs around her wrists behind her back. She shrieked in disbelief. The 2 board members froze. The woman dropped her camera. The man stammered, You can't do that. That's assault. Frank turned to him with the authority of a man who had once led full SWAT operations. It's called a citizen's arrest. It's legal. She trespassed after being warned. Tried to force her way into my home. That makes her a criminal, not a victim. Karen twisted and yelled every threat she could think of. Lawsuits, arrests, public disgrace. But Frank wasn't fazed. He simply reached for his old flip phone and dialed the local sheriff. Tom, it's Frank. I've got a situation up here. Might want to send someone out. Then he looked down at Karen, now red-faced and fuming, and said with a slight smile, You should have brought a warrant, not a clipboard. The air around the cabin had grown tense, like the mountain itself was holding its breath. Karen writhed against the cuffs, her face a cocktail of rage, shock, and disbelief. It was clear this was the first time anyone had ever laid a hand on her, let alone arrested her. She looked up at Grandpa Frank like he had just committed an unforgivable sin against authority itself. Her lips moved fast, spewing a flood of threats and accusations, but none of it mattered to him. I didn't know anymore. She'd crossed the line. And now she was going to learn what consequences really looked like. The other 2 HOA board members stood frozen near the front steps, still processing what had just happened. The pudgy man's folder trembled slightly. In his hands, his mouth twitching as if he wanted to speak, but couldn't find the words. The woman with the slick back hair looked like she might run, but her pride kept her anchored. They had come here thinking they were the law. Now, they were staring at a man who actually knew it. Frank motioned toward the porch swing with his chin. "She's not going anywhere, but you two can sit down if you don't want to keep standing there like stunned pigeons." Neither moved. Frank didn't care. He gently guided Karen to a wooden chair near the front door and sat her down, still cuffed. "You're not hurt," he said flatly. "But you're not leaving until the sheriff arrives. You should have known better," Karen hissed. "You'll be sued for this. Fired, jailed, you'll lose everything." Frank almost smiled. "Retired, ma'am. 27 years in law enforcement. I know exactly what I'm allowed to do. You just barged onto private property and tried to force your way into someone's home without a warrant or a cause. That's a criminal offense." He turned and picked up the camera the HOA woman had dropped. He flipped through the photos calmly, then deleted them all with a few taps and set the camera back down. "You're not going to twist this into something." It wasn't. Then 15 minutes, the sound of wheels crunching on gravel returned. A white sheriff's SUV rolled up the drive and came to a calm stop behind the HOA cars. Sheriff Tom Hastings stepped out, a tall, weathered man with a ball cap, mirrored sunglasses, and a knowing look on his face. He'd worked with Frank for over a decade before Frank retired. If there was anyone who wouldn't be fooled by a well-dressed liar, it was Tom. "What in the hell is going on up here?" he asked as he walked up the porch steps. Frank gave a simple nod toward Karen. "Trespassing. Attempted unlawful entry. Citizen's arrest. Figured I'd save you the trouble."
I looked down at Karen,
Then up at the board members who now looked like school kids caught cheating. "You all part of this circus?" The man with the tie stumbled forward. "We're from the HOA. She was just enforcing an emergency inspection based on community guidelines." Tom raised an eyebrow. "Emergency inspection? You got any official paperwork from a judge? A warrant? County orders?" The man froze. "Well, no, but nothing," Tom interrupted. He turned to Karen, who had finally stopped yelling, though her jaw was still clenched. "Ma'am, I don't know what kind of operation you think you're running, but this here is private land. You can't just walk into someone's house because you feel entitled to it." Karen opened her mouth to argue, but Tom held up a finger. "Don't you already made enough mistakes today?" After checking the cuffs and confirming that Karen was unharmed, Tom nodded at Frank. "You did it by the book. I'll take it from here." Karen's expression shifted from fury to desperation. "You're just going to let him get away with this?" Tom gave her a hard look. "You're lucky this didn't turn out worse. You're leaving here in my car today? If the DA agrees, you'll be facing charges. HOA doesn't give you the right to break the law." He led her away in silence, the board members trailing after, defeated and dumbfounded. Frank watched them go, the mountains quiet again, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. The door behind him creaked as it closed, the sound of finality. Inside, the cabin stood untouched, undisturbed, just as it always should have been. The news traveled faster than wildfire through the mountain communities surrounding Hawthorne Ridge. By the next morning, the footage was everywhere on Facebook groups, Reddit threads, and even the local news. One of the board members, trying to quietly slip away during Karen's arrest, had failed to notice a teenager from a neighboring cabin filming the whole scene from behind a row of trees. The video captured everything: Karen barking orders, the ridiculous citations, her attempt to force the door open, and the swift click of Grandpa Frank's handcuffs around her wrists. The video was titled, "HOA Karen Arrested by Retired Sheriff After Bizarre Cabin Raid," and within hours it went viral. Comment sections exploded with applause, disbelief, and laughter. Frank's calm demeanor and no-nonsense handling of the situation made him an overnight internet legend. Karen, on the other hand, became the face of everything people hated about overreaching HOAs. But while the internet celebrated, there were real consequences being carried out behind the scenes. Sheriff Tom Hastings followed through with the paperwork. Karen was officially charged with trespassing, harassment, and attempted unlawful entry. When questioned during her statement, she tried to argue that the HOA had granted her emergency enforcement rights. That claim was quickly dismantled in court. No judge had signed off on anything, and the HOA's Section 14B was found to be not only vague, but unenforceable. It wasn't long before the county launched an investigation into the HOA's leadership. Turns out Karen wasn't just aggressive, she was